Hey guys and girls, Bored now, back with you on this video. I'm going to be talking about Star Trek Picard Season 3, Episode 4. The episode is called No Win Scenario. Full spoilers from the start of this review, and what a shit show this series is turning into. This may be even worse than Episode 1. I don't know where to start with this nonsense. First of all, there's no Worf and no Raffi plot this week. You may cheer because no Raffi, but then on the other hand, there's no Worf, and he was kind of turning into the highlight of this show. But yeah, this is a really rough episode. We get more really sluggish, slow nostalgia beats with Picard. Lots of like flashbacks and memories and all this nonsense they've been waffling on about pretty much all season. So it really moves at a snail's pace. This episode, the pacing is really sluggish. It's almost an hour long. It's about 58 minutes, which is way too long, especially for what we get in. So the main arc of the episode is Picard coming to this realization of what needs to be done to get them out of the wormhole. I forget the nebula, and for him and his son Jack to reconnect and to like hatch a plan to get them all out of it. And that's the very simple basic arc, but we just go through so much treacle to like get there. So first of all, I'll just talk a bit about the Amanda Plummer villain, because she's totally wasted in this episode. Remember 2 episodes ago how I praised her and how she was like the highlight of that episode and just seemed like a really promising villain moving forward. Now, I'm expecting her to return because she's not like 100% eliminated at the end of this one, but she's once again given nothing to do. Like, she was sort of relegated to a very minor role last time. And in this one, it's revealed that she's working for a changeling. A changeling is giving her orders. By the way, some really dodgy CGI effects for the changing, for them mutating into like sludge, or goo as it's called in this episode. And I'll get to some of the language in this episode in a bit, because the language is a lot of what's putting me off this series. It's really taken me out of a lot of this stuff. But we find out that then the Amanda Plummer character is working for a changeling, and we get a sequence where the changeling comes aboard and infects her and insists, and she pursues onwards, and so that's what she does. And we get a couple of hammy moments from her, but we really don't get much from her before the ship she's on, the Strike, is ultimately like defeated and is shoved to the side, where when the Titan fires like a meteor into it and the ship starts to evaporate. So we get very little with her in this episode, which is a real shame. So the setup is at the start of the episode, we jump back 5 years to Picard when he's in the bar. So the simulation of the bar that we've seen him return to time after time. And you get this really cheesy, dreary sequence where he's surrounded by all these younger, like, Starfleet officers, and they just clamour for, like, war stories and how did you defeat such and such, how did you overcome this? And it just turned into this really overly nostalgic, like, dialogue from him, where he's, like, giving these grand speeches, and they're just treating him like this massive celebrity. Like, the whole thing that sort of flies in the face of what Picard is supposed to represent and what Starfleet is meant to represent. And it just takes up far too much time in the episode. So it does show you later on what it's doing and why we're seeing that scene. But it's just taking a lot of time out that could be better used for other characters and other things. This is really the point in the show where Picard, as the character, his ego is like really suffocating things. But what we leads to is then later on in the episode, as a way to reconnect with Jack, or connect for the first time, I guess, he takes him to the bar, he takes him to this simulation, and he starts reminiscing, he starts giving him a lesson about the past, and tries to connect, because once again, in the early part of the episode, Picard and Riker are at odds. Riker has like banished him to like his room. Basically, it's like giving him, it's like grounding Picard, 80-year-old Picard, for bad manners. And what really annoyed me was the reveal that Picard is actually right, and I just didn't want him to be, because first of all, a lot of logic says then, no, he was being a bit brash, he was being a bit arrogant, he was putting like crew members' lives in dangers. But I guess the message they're going for is, in this case, the heroes are the ones who take risks. But that really bugged me, how soon Riker turned around and he comes to Picard's quarters and he does this whole thing about, yeah, you were right, I was wrong. But just to amp up the drama a little bit more, Riker is like being very like grieving. Like he's in that sort of phase where he's like, we're at the bottom of the ocean almost, because they start talking about, it's almost like the ocean in space, but it's like the ship is sinking. So yeah, he starts talking about how we've not got a lot of time yet left. So he starts advising Picard, use this time wisely, use the next 3 hours or so to like bond with your son. And so once again, and this is the weakest episode for Jack, I think. Jack really, up to now, I'd at least been into him a little bit, like he'd been a decent episode, but the scenes with him and Picard in this episode are so tedious. But once again, like Riker just giving up just made him look really weak, and it sort of felt like we jumped to this point too soon. Like after 4 episodes, or after like an episode in this situation. But Riker is considering sending a message to Troy in the event he doesn't make it, and in the end he pulls out. He doesn't send a message, maybe hoping they can still do something. But yeah, that's what they're going for. So jumping once again to Picard and Jack and that nonsense. So Picard starts telling Jack the stories about the past. And this is another big problem with the episode, and it's a big problem with this series of Picard in particular, is the sort of language Picard has been using. And I mean, he really should be sent to quarters for this sort of language, but the amount of like un-Star Trek language we get in this episode, it is so jarring and so in your face, because he's telling Jack this story, he's reminiscing, and out of nowhere he starts like swearing, but in the most blatant of ways. It's like 10 fucking hours, he says at one point. And then Shaw cuts in, and Shaw starts running Picard down. He starts telling Jack, well, that's one story, but let me enlighten you about your old man and his crimes. And he starts telling Jack about how Picard, as the Borg, when he was possessed by the Borg cube, he let thousands, millions of people die and left them to die, and that's sort of the narrative. And then Shaw has this really clunky line when Picard and Jack leave, when he's telling because you've got all these onlookers, like these holograms, and they're staring holes in Shaw. So he has this line back to them, like, "Oh, I'm sorry, but at some point, being an arsehole became charming," or something. His line was. It was a really clunky line of dialogue, but you're now getting a lot of these lines of dialogue that just don't feel like Trek, and they just feel like they're from another show. And I'm wondering really if, like, because we've got these new showrunners for season 3, like apparently they came from the 12 Monkeys TV show, and it definitely feels in an episode like this, then they're just going for this more moody, sort of self-indulgent quite tone, where it's like, oh, we've got to do the dark Star Trek show now, and a little of that can work, as I've said, but this just feels like overkill, and it just feels like it's really dark, moody, self-indulgent, but just for the sake of it, where it's not got a lot of purpose. So that's that stuff, and then later on, when they decide that they need Shaw's help because they figure out he's the only one who can, like, work the engines, you get another similar scene where Picard comes to his quarters. He calls him a dipshit. Picard calls someone a dipshit. I think even Shaw was stunned, maybe the actor and the character. But then he says, yeah, you're the only ones who can do this. And they use the word grease monkey. Grease monkey in an episode of Star Trek. Even for modern Trek, come on, that's a bit much. So they hatch this plan which they have to talk Riker into, because it's the three of them together, Jack, Beverly and Picard, come up with this idea to leech power off like these things in space as they're going through like the nebula, to sort of suck power into themselves so they can build up energy to leap out of there. Something along those lines. It all sounded like scientific nonsense to me, but that's the basis of their plan, and that's why they need to get Shaw involved, because they figure he's the only one with the experience to do it. So you have sort of like a family moment coming together, the three of them to come up with this plan. And there's a little bit of tension, but of course ultimately it works. Probably the best scene in the episode is when the Forge appears in the engine room, when Shaw and it's Seven, because they've sort of banded together in the episode to work together. So she appears out of nowhere, that being the Forge. And it turns out it's the shapeshifter in the Ford mode, in her form. So it's like a trick to try and sabotage what they're doing. There's that word again, sabotage. There's a couple of sabotage use of that in this episode, and there's also at least one more use of the word legend. So just in case you're playing Picard Bingo at home, legend gets used again. So that's probably the scene of the episode, because Seven catches her out in a lie and then dissolves her, and it's a nice little moment of tension and a decent reveal. Shaw's there as well, because Shaw's like questioning her, and like the changeling is trying to get information out of him. So that for me is probably the best scene of the episode. There's also this other business about the changeling with Seven, and she's given advice by Shaw, who's really going through the motions in this episode, by the way, but he gives her advice about the changeling turning into goo. And this is just another example of them rushing through this stuff, because he tells her then the changeling takes on certain forms and it rests, like it goes into puddles at various times to like rest itself. And it's like, if you can find substance somewhere on the ship and it's calling it like change goo or something, then you've got a chance to catch it. And conveniently, Seven catches it very, very quickly. And she's about to like dispose of it or like take it somewhere to quarters. This stuff is just absolutely bonkers. I kind of like it for how silly it is, but it's bonkers nonetheless. But then there's another saboteur on board, as it turns out, someone who's on the inside again and shoots at Seven, and she has to fire back. She gets injured in the process. But that's a whole thing as well. But just such a messy, really plodding episode. And in the end, of course, we get that their plan works. They escape the nebula, and as I said, you get the whole thing, which is Jack's idea of like use it. No, it's actually Riker's idea. Sorry, because he's controlling the ship. Although Picard, they give him his sort of power back as like the main captain. But yeah, Riker fires off a meteor into like the strike, and that knocks them off course. And yeah, you see the effects on the inside of the strike. But cliffhanger ahoy, because we hear like a monologue from Picard, who has basically taken over the ship now. So they're doing the whole next generation thing in season 3 of Picard, and he does the final frontier like speeches, and you hear him like pondering what the interest is with his son Jack from this villain, the Amanda Plummer villain, whose name I still can't memorize. And then it cuts to a scene with Jack in his quarters, and he starts having flashes inside his head, and wouldn't you know, it's the changelings appearing to him. So it seems like there's more to Jack than meets the eye, and there's this connection to him. And it was very Stranger Things, actually. Like, it seemed to be a similar like design to like the Upside Down world, but appearing in Jack's head. So that's the cliffhanger of the episode, and it was a really, really crappy episode. Bits of it was so bad it was kind of good, so that's the only credit I'm going to give this one, because there were moments that made me laugh out loud. But yeah, a really rough time. It's definitely up there for the worst episode of the season. It's either this or the first one for me. Very little to recommend it. So that's Star Trek Picard, episode 4 of season 3. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe as always. Share me out on social media, and look out for more TV reviews on the way. More like modern TV reviews. We're going to be covering season 2 of Yellow Jackets. That's coming up near the end of March. And I will also be covering season 4 of HBO's Succession, and that's going to be the final season. So a couple of other much better modern shows which I'll be covering on the channel. Also, if you're a horror movie fan, you can check out some of my and Rachel McDonald's horror reviews. We've been covering the Scream franchise, and we will be covering Scream 6, so you can look out for the review of the new Scream movie on the way. We've also been covering various other things, such as the Final Destination movies, and we recently did a review for the remake of My Bloody Valentine, so lots of horror content on the channel as well. But I'll be back with more Picard soon, and I'm just going to sign off with, you know what, this episode was pretty crap, but it's still a 10. I'll see you guys later.